Hello again, Admiral Larry Chambers here. I am going to remove my mask. I am indoors and I'm at least 6 feet away from any other living soul. And hopefully we're all practicing safe separation in the year of the CV-19. In 1945, I was commanding officer of USS Midway. I relieved Captain Dick Schulte in Yokosuka, Japan, and on early March, we got underway, proceeded down to Subic Bay, and we were told to maintain readiness to get underway in 4 hours. We were expecting in Subic to have a 10-day upkeep, and lo and behold, a few hours later, we were giving notice to get underway. We fortunately had half of our boiler power still online, and so we got underway in less than 4 hours and proceeded to the South China Sea, where we were expected to rendezvous with some big jolly green giant HH-53 helicopters flown by the U.S. Air Force. Upon arrival south of the southern tip of Vietnam, 10 HH-53s belonging to the Air Sea Rescue Air Force came aboard, and Midway suddenly became a helicopter carrier. We proceeded up towards Vung Tau, and which is at the mouth of the river leading down from Saigon, and we were about 100 miles at sea doing the evacuation. We sat there for 4 or 5 days waiting for the order to execute, and as it turns out, we practice all kinds of drills, and no matter how much you practice, you'll never get it all right, but we did the best we could, and along about the 29th of April, I believe it was, we commenced Operation Frequent Wind. We had multiple helicopters ferrying people out of Saigon where they picked the people up at various places in Saigon. The H-53s were also going back and forth, and the H-53s had almost 250 people on each one. The people were not strapped down. They were using cargo nets to take care of it. And Huey, which were small helicopters with skids, were picking up all over Saigon, and many Hueys landed on board with as many as 50 people getting out of a Huey. Now you must remember, a Huey was designed for 10 Marines loaded for combat or 10 Army Rangers loaded for combat, and it was unbelievable that 50 people, as many as 50 people got out of the helicopters. We continued on during the night, and somewhere along about 1 o'clock in the morning, Hancock, one of our sister ships, had an emergency, and she had a crash on deck, and so she stopped handling helicopters, and at that time, Hancock had 8 helicopters airborne, all low on gas, and in the middle of the chaos that we had aboard Midway, we cleared a couple of spots on deck, and we managed to bootstrap those guys and refuel them, and by the time we got them all topped off, Hancock had cleared the deck, so instead of taking the refugees aboard Midway, we sent them on back to Hancock. And this routine continued all night long, and I don't know, many of you have visited Midway, and if you look at that deck, you'll see that non-skid coating on the deck, and we were handling women and children and babies and elderly folks, and my concern was it was going to be a disaster, and as it turns out, except for a few skinned knees and elbows, we managed to handle all of those folks in a humanitarian way. And in the middle of the chaos, a little airplane, a Cessna 01 Bird Dog, started circling Midway, and he kept dropping notes, and 3 of the notes went over the side, The fourth note he dropped, apparently he wrapped it in his pistol, and it stayed on deck because it hit the crash truck, and we rescued the note. And basically it said his name was Major Bong. He had his wife and 5 children in the airplane, and he had 1 hour of fuel remaining. Well, unfortunately, we were more than 110 miles, nautical miles at sea, and Major Bong Lee did not have enough gas to make it back to the beach. And in the meantime, the Admiral was yelling at me to tell the Major to ditch, and it was obvious that when we put our glasses on the little airplane, we could see that there was a lady in back holding a baby, and we could see one head poking out from the baggage compartment. So we knew that there were souls on board that weren't strapped in, and so it was fruitful to think that he was going to be able to land at sea, and we would be able to recover the folks. Besides, he had fixed landing gear, and when he landed in the water with fixed gear, it was going to flip over upside down. And my guess was everybody was going to drown. Major Lee was probably a good swimmer, but I'm sure he was going to be in the process of trying to save his families. But anyway, the Admiral told me not to, and I called my air boss and said, "Hey guys, we got to make a ready deck. There is no other choice." And the air boss suggested that I had lost my mind because we didn't have any place to put all of those airplanes, and actually helicopters. And so I suggested to Vern Jumper, the air boss, that we had to push those over the side. And he said, "How am I going to do it?" And I got on the ship's general announcing system, and I invited all sailors not on watch to report to the flight deck. And I expected the people who were used to the flight deck to show up. Well, as it turns out, the Marines showed up, the engineers showed up, everybody that actually wasn't on watch, and the JOs whose airplanes were tied down on the hangar deck showed up. So Vern had somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000 people to help him clear the deck. And in the process, I told Vern that he had to push him over the side. And I didn't count him because I knew I was going to be held responsible for it, since the Admiral had already told me not to make the recovery attempt. We got the deck cleared and gave Major Lee a green light, a green Aldous lamp, since we didn't have any communications with him, which was a signal to land. And as we turned into the wind, 8 more Huey helicopters from Saigon landed in the middle of the deck that we had just cleared. And the air boss wanted to know, what are we going to do now? And I said, boy, we're in deep, you know what, already 8 more is not going to make the difference between whether we go to jail or not. Push those over the side too. And so Vern got the crew back, and they pushed them all over the side, and we gave the Major green light, the green Aldous lamp. All you aviators know that the control tower can signal you with a red signal saying the deck's closed, or a green signal saying the deck is open. And Major Lee turned around. Meantime, I had told the ship that I was, the engineer, that I was going to need 25 knots out of the ship. And because we had been operating helicopters and we had a natural wind of about 10-15 knots over the deck, we didn't need any speed out of the ship. And he said that he couldn't get the boilers back online in time, so I told him to take 2 of the ship service generators that were steam driven and turn those electrical loads over to the emergency diesels. And so we had enough steam to get the old girl up to 25 knots, and with my 15 knots of natural wind, we were going to have 40 knots of wind over the deck. So my roughly 750, 800 foot runway now is the equivalent of about 1,500 to 2,000 foot runway. So there was no danger that Major Lee was going to run off. The real problem was when you get that much wind over the deck, there is turbulence behind the ship, and I was worried as to whether or not the Major could handle the turbulence. As it turns out, he made a perfect landing. And meanwhile, after the recovery, all of those wonderful people that had helped to clear the flight deck were all manning Vulture's Row, and they gave out a big cheer as the Major stepped out of the airplane. They brought the Major up to the bridge so that I could have a few minutes with him. And when he came to the bridge, I took off my gold wings and I presented them to the Major, and I made him an honorary naval aviator. To my knowledge, until many years later, he was the only guy I knew that landed on a ship without a tail hook, and other than blimps. Anyway, I had a chance to meet the Major later at Sun and Fun in 2014, and it was there that I discovered that his wife couldn't swim, so there was no way that the Major was going to ditch that airplane. And that's basically the saga of Vietnam. It was tough times for all, and oh, by the way, I fully expected to have the shortest command tour on record because I did what the Admiral told me not to do. Thank you very much.